Economic commentator Saul Eslake has been watching the budget closely. I spoke to him from Melbourne late today. Saul Eslake, was today's budget tough enough?
I'd describe it as a substantial contribution to the budget's stated objective of putting Tasmania's finances back on a sustainable position. For that to be a confident prediction, the government's going to have to deliver on all of the saving measures that it's announced, many in merely general terms in today's budget. And as the budget papers themselves admit, it will have to do more in subsequent budgets to achieve all of the targets it set itself in its new fiscal strategy.
What about the across-the-board agency reduction in spending? Is that the right strategy?
Well, it is if they can deliver on it, and that's the big question hanging over this budget. The savings measures outlined in the budget papers do rely a lot on cultural change in the system, on improvements in the efficiency of corporate services, on voluntary redundancies, on various other things that aren't fully spelt out in detail and are the subject of various reviews of the way in which government services are conducted. Now, I don't necessarily imagine that the government could have, in the small number of weeks since the interim mid-year budget review was announced, which really brought home the extent of the revenue shortfall that Tasmania was facing, the government could have figured out all of the ways of delivering the savings it's ultimately needing to achieve. But historically, the government's track record on delivering these kind of savings isn't all that good. And over the last 5 years, for example, expenses have averaged 200 million per annum more than was forecast in each year's budget, or as much as 500 million per annum more than was forecast in the forward estimates for 3 years before. So the government's going to have to drastically improve on its past performance in meeting budget spending targets if the targets laid out in this year's budget, which is so much more demanding, are to be achieved.
You've been very critical of Tasmania's educational outcomes. What about the move to actually close 20 schools?
Well, I think these are the kind of economies that are going to have to be made if Tasmania is going to make serious inroads into what I've described as the fundamental problem, which is that Tasmania spends far more per head, or as a proportion of the state's income, delivering public services like education and health than other states and territories on average, by a much bigger margin than can be explained by Tasmania's relatively small and dispersed population, or by the fact that a higher proportion of Tasmania's population is in need of many public services than any other states. And one of the examples of the long-standing inefficiency in the delivery of services is that Tasmania has too many small schools that, despite the best efforts of the teachers working in them, and I don't belittle that for 1 minute, can't deliver the range of educational opportunities that bigger schools could do to children who live in some of Tasmania's smallest and most far-flung communities. And although undoubtedly families who are affected by school closures will not like the idea of the kids travelling on the bus for perhaps half an hour a day in each direction in order to go to school, my guess is that they will probably end up getting a better range of subjects to study while they're at school, as well as saving the state considerable amount of money that ultimately will make a better education system more sustainable.
Should any of the government businesses have been put on the market?
Well, I think ultimately that's something that the government ought to be considering, although I do note the budget papers say that in present circumstances selling assets in order, for example, to fund increased infrastructure spending isn't the right way to go. Tasmanians will, I'm sure, be aware that the sky hasn't fallen in states like New South Wales and Queensland, where Labor governments have in recent years sold the equivalent of businesses like Aurora to the private sector, any more than the sky's fallen in Victoria, where these kind of businesses were sold to the private sector almost 15 years ago.
Does the government spread itself too thin? Rather than across-the-board spending cuts, are there in fact departments that could in fact have been culled?
I'm not sure there's a case for the wholesale abolition of departments. There might be for some individual agencies. Certainly I think there's scope for the government to consider outsourcing to not-for-profit organisations, or indeed in some cases to agencies of other governments like the federal government or local governments, some things which at the moment are done by standalone state government agencies. For example, specifically things like the Land Titles Office, which could probably easily be conducted in Tasmania by its Victorian equivalent. Many of the housing department functions could be transferred to community housing organisations that are beginning to emerge in Tasmania, as they have done on the mainland. I've argued that the government could outsource the collection of payroll tax to the Australian Tax Office, and land tax and perhaps stamp duties on land transfers to local governments, and perhaps pay a commission for doing that, and thus save all the costs associated with running the State Revenue Office. Now, these might be small individually, but they amount to a sensible examination of what's feasible and sustainable for a relatively small state like Tasmania to do.
We'll have to wait and see how the community judges this budget. Saul Eslake, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me, Ellie.